Check. Oh, it's on. Okay. Good morning, everybody. Welcome to our first panel of the day, but last panel for the conference. And I'd like to begin by acknowledging that we are on the land of Chippewa of the Rama First Nation, and that we have four speakers, 3 presentations, and that we will begin with a presentation from Laith Marouf and Chris Albinati. And I would just like to introduce our speakers. Okay, sure.
Thank you everybody for coming to the last presentation early on a Sunday. My name is Laith Marouf, and I am a long-term multimedia producer and consultant. Currently, I work for the Community Media Advocacy Center, advocating for community and indigenous owned multimedia infrastructure. We're here today. I'm with Chris also, who is our legal advisor, but he'll introduce himself more when he starts speaking. But we're here to talk about why policy advocacy is important for activists, and why specifically at the CRTC. You know, a lot of us working on social progress and media in general understand that when you are trying to do social change, that means you will be battling in every field that is open to you. So let's say you're working on environmental issues, you're gonna try to educate in the student population. You're gonna do work in universities. You're going to go do work in rural communities. You're gonna do work in the indigenous communities. You're gonna do work in communities that have extraction resources happening. You're gonna do it at the media level. You're gonna do it at the government level. You're gonna do it at the court levels, and so on and so forth. So it's in that context, it's the same thing when we're doing media advocacy work. You know, you cannot just try to build, let's say, media outlets and whether it's magazines, newspapers, radios, televisions, whatever it is, and then leave all the other battlefields open, you know, with no opposition to those who are in power. So we know that a lot of us as activists working on whatever subject that we work, we end up a lot of times in court, and we fight for legal rights in those courts. In that same context, you know, when you're doing media work and we leave the advocacy work at the CRTC, which is the regulator that is, you know, kind of semi-judicial organization empowered to regulate media, and we don't do that advocacy work there while we try to, you know, build media outlets and fight the mainstream media's biases and so on, it is almost futile if you do not also do the advocacy work at the CRTC. So in that context, you know, looking at the advocacy situation at the CRTC, you know, so now we understand why advocacy is important, at the CRTC specifically. But then, why did we choose to do this work? Because of our experiences, the various members of the board of CMAC, the staff at CMAC, also the Community Media Advocacy Center. You know, our experiences in the community radio sector and the community television sector in Canada showed that there's not much advocacy being done actually at the CRTC on behalf of the positions that we support. And in fact, at some points, you know, the word advocacy has become something that is looked down at in some of the circles that of the community media that we know about in Canada. So in that context, and seeing that there's a deterioration of, on the one hand, of the whole community radio and community television sectors, that community television practically doesn't exist in this country, and the fact that indigenous broadcasters, radios and televisions are segregated within our policy frameworks and excluded from whatever we consider as community media, and the new phase of exclusion of ethnic communities and pushing them into licenses of that are private corporate licenses for ethnic community broadcasting. In that context, that's why we created CMAC and launched it, because there was a clear need for it, and there was no representation, and there was fragmentation and segregation of the various communities that need access to broadcast capabilities. So I don't know how good am I going on time for. I should have probably timed myself. But so we launched CMAC in last September 2015. And since then, we've engaged at the CRTC on multiple levels. We have helped indigenous communities apply for licenses for radio. That's something our priority work right now is on the indigenous communities. And so we've, for instance, worked with Wawate Radio Network, which is owned by the Anishinaabe Aske Nation, the Ojibwe Cree Alliance in Ontario, to apply for 2 licenses in Ottawa and Toronto. And we're now waiting for so our work is that we absorb the costs, we absorb the time and effort that needs to be put on behalf of these communities, and we do all the work under their direction to, let's say, to the application for license. We've also appeared already multiple times in front of the CRTC in this very small, short time frame. The latest being at the local and community television policy review that happened in January. And we've intervened on so many other files in this very short time frame. So you could see that how there was a service that is needed, that is desperately needed by specifically, these communities that are segregated and excluded from the rest of the system, and that there is a thirst for this. If we want to today, we could drown ourselves in work in terms of how many communities need support on so many levels, and we're kind of like we're pacing ourselves in order not to take on too much, but in a way this is why we think policy work is very important. Some people think that policy work is boring or it's not revolutionary enough, and so on and so forth. But in putting it in that context of holistic approach of social change, battling at every field that you can, then you understand that this policy work is very, very important for the health of community medias and indigenous medias in this country. And I'm going to let it be at that. Thank you.
Mabetsi Big Bikat Tansi Chris Albinati. I'm Isanaya and a lawyer. I work with Navagabo Corbiera, a firm just on the Rama Reserve nearby. And I'm a graduate student at Osgood, finishing up my master's degree and starting my PhD this fall, working on Indigenous land rights issues, focusing specifically on how blockades assert Indigenous law on the ground and disrupt and create sites of conflict for wrestling with questions about Canada's story of colonialism and its reality of colonialism. But I got my start in all of this really in radio and community radio as a journalist working at CKUT about 10 years ago now. And so it's been quite a journey. CKUT really taught me about, you go to journalism school and they teach you to go out with a microphone and to report or collect some stories and then cut them together to make a broader sort of synthesized story for a broader audience. But CKUT taught me about doing journalism in a way that connected with communities, that was about engaging them and finding those sites of struggle and those voices that were marginalized that needed to be represented in the media, that were being excluded by the mainstream media. And so CKUT taught me about those ways in which you use the tools that are available to you to disrupt and to create positive change in that way. So I took that and I've applied that as a lawyer and now as an academic to better and well, I think always to better ends. So this is another thing that we do with CMAC, and me as the legal counsel, I sort of look at the technical aspects of it, the regulatory stuff. But I wanted to just cover a couple things too in terms of just what do we mean by policy advocacy? So first, what do we mean by advocacy? Well, advocacy is about, if you're talking about systemic change, you have to start by acknowledging that there's a system that needs changing. If you're talking about anti-oppression, you have to acknowledge that there's oppression. You have to identify it. If you're talking about decolonization, you have to acknowledge the colonization that you're working against, right? So we acknowledge that there is something that needs to be changed, so we have to identify the best sites where we can enact that change. Policy is a site for change, although it can be boring, it can be filled with jargon and terms. One of the things I said yesterday at the other workshop was that the reason why legal jargon can be seem elitist or oppressive, I think, is because there aren't enough good lawyers to explain those terms and why we need them and what are the benefits of them. But policy is a site for change, and so CRTC, the Canadian Radio Telecommunications Commission, is that government-created organization construct that has been delegated the authority or the control over deciding what policy is going to be implemented and imposed for regulating media and community media in particular. So how does CMAC do policy advocacy in the way we're talking about? CMAC is built from the ground up on connection and rooting in the community. It's about community engagement. Everybody who's involved in this organization has come from years of experience and struggle working in community radio and in community media and working on trying to advance change. So we have an ethos or a mandate that is about engaging with the community and finding ways in which our skills and our experience and knowledge can be brought to support what they want to secure, what they want to achieve. In terms of the CRTC in particular, if they want to seek a license or if they want to engage in a policy hearing, such as the community television hearings that happened in January, which CMAC was a part of, and I'll explain a bit in a minute. We can help by bringing information and support and other advocacy sort of work to those communities so that they can engage in that process. And so, just briefly, the CRTC hearings are open to the public, but they're supposed to bring in the people who are being directly impacted by the policies that are being talked about. And typically what ends up happening is that the major community, or not, the major sort of corporate media groups tend to dominate these hearings. They have, it was kind of funny, we showed up at the ComTV hearings and they had two long rows for sitting in front of the panel. And, sometimes the groups presenting are just one person or three people, and we were kind of trying to figure out why there's these two huge rows. And then Bell shows up, and they have literally one person speaking. Everybody gets 15 minutes to speak or whatever. They have one person speaking, but a whole row of lawyers for some reason, you know, to show up at these policy hearings. So there are very sort of visual kind of imbalances in this process, and we try to engage in that. CMAC, what we identified, and what really was telling in the outcomes of the ComTV hearings that happened in January, was that CMAC was really bringing a unique contribution to this entire process of policy hearing. Not only was it in the content and the arguments and the things that we were presenting, but just in the fact that we were a panel of 5 presenters, all people of color, you know, 3 of them were women, and that we were presenting a diverse opinion to a board, the CRTC, that since its history, since its inception, and even its predecessor, has been 98.1% white. And I think 98.1, well, definitely 98.1% white and probably 90% male in its history, right? So those are some of the things that we acknowledge and that we have to reflect sites of change. So even by just being a panel made up mostly of women and people of color and projecting that towards them, it was a way of visually challenging them on that, on the makeup of who should be engaging in the conversations around policy. But what came out of our contributions to the community television hearings was the way in which we addressed policy advocacy, was the way in which we approached it. So typically, there are groups like the NCRA, or there are groups like Cactus and other even PIAC, the Public Interest Advocacy Center, that get involved in these public hearings. And they have lawyers that, you know, do some research and then present a memo to the board. But what we were doing was we were actively engaging throughout the process. So we did our research and we presented our first arguments, but then as the hearings were going on, we were going through the transcripts of every other presenter, which was time consuming but worthwhile, because we were pulling out the evidence that other people were giving, so that in our final submissions we were summarizing the problems and handing them to the board, the CRTC, to make it even easier for them to identify the points of change that need to happen and the ways in which recommending where those changes can happen. So comparing our work to someone like Bell or Videotron with a bank of lawyers, they're just reciting the same old stuff that they're doing. They have these massive expensive surveys, customer surveys and reports that they've put together, and yet their engagement, their level of engagement with the actual material coming out and basically the real story that is being presented through the numerous contributors to these public hearings, nobody was engaging with that except for CMAC. And so I think that is one way in which, you know, starting with a community engagement approach, with that ethos, starting with an understanding of policy advocacy, about not trying to just change something for yourself, but about finding the broader and the systemic problems, acknowledging those, and then looking for the ways in which those need to be changed, looking for the weak points or the pressure points where those can be pushed. Because we're not a big organization, but we use our resources in such an efficient and targeted way that we think we make a strong contribution there. And I think that sort of, you know, in our unique contribution to the community television hearings, that came through. And I don't have much to add. I think we have a couple minutes, but Laith, I'll let you wrap up if you have a closing word or two.
Well, I mean, Chris did a really good job, like speaking on the specifics and the details of why and how advocacy work can actually be not only social, you know, advocate for social change, but actually could be very radical. I mean, when we, Chris mentioned, you know, the appearance, how itself the appearance of CMAC being led by women and people of color and indigenous peoples, that actually changed the whole way that the CRTC was engaging during that policy review. We were the first to open up the talking about indigenous peoples in the policy, review of the community television, local television. We were the first to talk about people of disabilities, with disabilities and the communities of color. So in that, you saw the engagement that of the board, the commissioners that were sitting, took that very seriously, because they were like, oh, now we're having something unusual being put in front of us. We're hearing the same repetitive thing of the corporations asking for more money and everybody and the majority population complaining. There was, until that point, the voice wasn't there. So it opened up a space, and this is what we are saying to you. In reality, policy work can be very radical, can be revolutionary. You don't have to compromise on those positions, and you have to coming to that venue to say, I will take my space in this venue like we took it somewhere else. And that's how policy advocacy can be very powerful.
Thank you. Thanks very much. We're going to shift gears just a little bit, moving on to our effectively third speaker. And it's my pleasure to introduce Carolyn Huang. Would you like to say a few words to introduce yourself, Carolyn?
Yeah.
It's probably best that way, yeah.
My name is Carolyn. I work at CKT, which was just mentioned earlier, a campus community radio station based in Montreal at McGill University. I guess for this presentation, I'm just speaking on behalf of, or a perspective as a person who grew up using social media and the internet and basically not being able to get out of it because I grew up on it. Get started. So as someone who has grown up with using the internet and social media, I've been reflecting a lot on how it's been beneficial but also disadvantageous to specifically social movements. I've noticed certain generational gaps in the way we use social media and the impact of that media on different generations. So this presentation comes from both my skepticism in terms of the ways in which there hasn't been much accountability and responsibility in terms of the social media work being done, but also my own feelings of feeling that I've benefited a lot in terms of connecting with people of similar politics and similar backgrounds and histories through social media. So it's kind of like both of those things I'm trying to work through. So this presentation is just kind of like small anecdotes of ideas I'm working through and not really a big coherent argument. So I guess in a time where the economy is shifting towards an information economy, I think there's a lot of different ideas that academia is working through, but maybe social movements are less so thinking about in terms of how labor is becoming more immaterial, like it's not visible, as you can see through a lot of social media and journalism work. And I think in this presentation, I'm going to try to frame social media as kind of a new sharing economy in terms of what Airbnb is doing, in terms of a lot of certain people's labors are being exploited through social media, and that it kind of affects writers who are trying to write for a living, because social media is this idea of like sharing. You can share your ideas, but certain people are being paid for the work that other people are sharing for free on the internet. But maybe I'll get into first some of the ways it's been beneficial first. So yeah, through the internet, the grounds for us to find others with similar politics, visions, priorities, and goals are ever so expansive. It means that we can have different discussions simultaneously and through multimedia, and access to social networks and information that would otherwise necessitate more time or is so much easier to find nowadays. As a millennial of color who grew up through internet space, I've kind of developed new ways of connecting with other millennial of color through the internet. So I've understood Tumblr as a place to develop friendships, and I know people who have met in person from first becoming internet friends, and even people who've dated through Tumblr. It was through internet space that I was able to understand the histories and legacies I've inherited, and witness important political conversations, and connect with other youth with similar histories and politics. So with this access, it means that people can now talk about politics in a very comprehensive and nuanced way from a distance. Through the internet, we now mourn differently, we share differently, and we fight differently. I've witnessed from my home, like in my bedroom, on my bed, like very intense events being live streamed through the internet. So it's like an interesting disconnect in that way, where if the comfort of your own home, you're witnessing really, really intense events unraveling in the world. And also, if I can't make it to a demo, frantically searching for a hashtag that my friends are at, or certain demos that are not proximate in my geographical location, and being able to follow what's happening out there, again, just through in my bed. And through the social media, you can see what's happening out in the world, and also if your friends are there, you can keep track of what's happening in terms of whether they're okay, and being able to send messages of care. So the use of Twitter was essential to the Quebec student movement and anti-austerity movement in 2012, and has been essential to the Black Lives Movement from 2013 to the present. People have been able to find each other at demonstrations through social media, film the actions of the police and put it up right away, and provide live time documentation of important moments, but also to set up networks of support and care after post-demo. So this is kind of facilitating a kind of online activism. And also, social media has been extremely beneficial to disability justice struggles. So mental health, mobility restraints, lack of access and accessibility, responsibilities of care and support, and all the burdens of work and capitalism are reasons why a lot of people can't be physically present at in-person meetings or at demonstrations. So social media has been so prevalent that we cannot ignore it as a political terrain for action. And it has provided space for those who've been neglected by by mainstream media, I mean. But yeah, given all those benefits, I'm going to go into some, I guess, limitations and struggles of social media. So within that framework of social media as a kind of labor that is often unpaid, I guess I'm trying to think through in what ways can we use it given these restraints, and also acknowledge that there are these restraints. So there was an article called that was published called Pink Collar, and it was published by someone named Jennifer Pan, who talks about how the realm of public relations and communications, this realm of a lot of social media work is a kind of emotional labor that is expended through the internet and is often gendered. And it relies on kind of an exploitation of that labor. So people who work in the public relations realm are often the ones that are disrespected and undervalued, because people who work in that realm, it's kind of like a kind of work that feels like there's no like starting time and end time of that labor. It's not a clear 9-to-5 job kind of thing, because it's emotional social labor. So she argues that the reason why this work is often disrespected is because it's dependent on emotional labor, a kind of labor that both sustains and is abused by capitalism. And then there's another article that was recently released, was an article called Sui Park and the Afterlife of Twitter by someone named Yasmin Nair. She is an activist with Against Equality, a queer collective that argues against, I guess, the mainstream gay rights movement of fighting just for marriage equality. And she basically goes through some events that have happened through Twitter, and arguing that Twitter has been essential to the formation of discourses of race and gender, whether in a positive way or negative way. She argues, quote, "To take Twitter seriously, we have to see it as a staging for neoliberals' injunction that everyone should now make and remake themselves in order to survive," end quote. So she basically argues that out of survival, we need to brand ourselves and our activism through Twitter, because that's the starting point of a lot of writers in terms of eventually getting paid. As she says, quote, "People are required to craft themselves into investment commodities," end quote. So people are forced to brand themselves, including their identities and experiences, and produce knowledge for free in hopes of eventually getting paid work. She also explores the idea of the exploitation of trauma narratives. So in terms of through social media, the focus is a lot on the trauma faced by women, and especially trans women and women of color. There's a certain kind of fetishization of their experiences, and it turns into kind of reproductive labor where these traumatic experiences of trans women and women of color become the only form of knowledge that is of interest, as opposed to their actual critique of the systems that harm them. So by only focusing on these narratives, we are neglecting the work that's done by trans women and women of color in terms of dismantling these harmful institutions that are creating the trauma in the first place. So in a time where social justice circles are rife with trigger warnings calling out an identity politics as acts of survival for some, structures of accountability need to be cultivated on and offline. We need to think about the challenges and responsibilities of having these conversations online, and also creating structures that support people who are harmed online, but also structures for people who are harming as well. Otherwise, such emotional labor reiterates the trauma, and the labor remains very much exhausted. Someone named Cedric Johnson, who's the author of From Revolutionaries to Race Leaders, Black Power, and the Making of African American Politics, states that, quote, "Social media is an effective means for publicizing and organizing certain kinds of events, connecting people across geographic expanses, and rapidly circulating information, but it cannot develop the kinds of deep bonds and relations of trust that are necessary for political activity predicated on risk-taking and protracted commitment. I mean, this is the quote that I was just thinking through, and I don't know if I completely agree yet, but it's interesting in terms of thinking about trust and how social media can or cannot form that kind of trust. So when we are caught in cycles of exhausted political arguments on social media, we cannot lose sight of the broader radical visions we are striving towards. There are ways in which social media work can be effective and affirmative of our social movements. So many actions flourish through social media, as do relationships. We just need to start thinking about how we can use social media more effectively and think about how some people's labor are exploited through social media, and basically build an online activism that recognizes the importance of some social media work, and that is more strategic to profound social justice organizing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. I would like to introduce our third speaker as she's setting up. Stefania. My mic is not on. So, is this on? It is. So as Stefania is setting up, I would like to introduce our final speaker. She's a researcher and activist fascinated by the politics of technology as it intersects with activism, social change, and governance. Stefania is assistant professor of new media at the University of Amsterdam, where she created the Data Active Research Collective, investigating the politics of massive data collection, and you can find that at data-activism.net. Prior to that, she worked at the Citizen Lab at the University of Toronto, and she is the author of Social Movements and Their Technologies, Wiring Social Change, which came out with Palgrave Macmillan. Stefania.
Thank you very much for the kind introduction, and apologies for having forced you to shift around a little bit the program. However, it gave me some time to listen to the presentations of my colleagues and adapt slightly mine. In that, I don't deliberately speak about advocacy here, but I try to create a connection that I'm going to explain in a minute. So I do believe advocacy is extremely important because it creates the conditions and the rules for us to operate. My political background and ideology, let's say, originally didn't bring me that close to advocacy or the state in general. But I came to believe that there is value in spending energies and time into creating the conditions for what becomes possible, in the near future. So what I'm going to share with you today is some work in progress that I've been working on since 2013 and never having the chance to finish. There's a lot of text in the PowerPoint, which is a little unusual from me, but it is a way of thinking through this topic. So this is a theoretical paper, apologies for that tries to assess social media and media activism of today in light of the literature that has really shaped, informed, but also fueled my interest and my work on media activism, let's say 15 years ago when I started working on this topic. And I realized that this is, so basically this literature on alternative, citizens, radical, and community media. But then what I realized is that a lot of this literature, which I think was fundamental for me and for the movement of that time, doesn't really speak much to the dynamics and what happens really on social media today. So it's an attempt to bridge the two, and of course, as you might have got by now, to critique social media a little bit. So mine is an invitation to think critically, to interrogate the technology we use in order to, of course, take advantage of all the possibilities they offer, but also to engage with the challenges and be a little more critical when we use them. For they come with some sort of political economy embedded and some sort of surveillance embedded in them, and we ought to consider this when we adopt them. So this is more or less what I want to share with you. What is the link with advocacy here? Well, not much explicitly, but in a way, think about, so what I asked throughout the presentation is, so do social media create subjectivity? Do they contribute to empower people? So we can also think about this as, and do social media create movements? As a sociologist, I can tell you that certainly they create mobilizations. Movements, it's a little bit more difficult to prove if we take certain definitions of movements. So the link with advocacy is then, what do social media contribute to create informed publics? And publics that are empowered, that have a certain perception of the collectivity, but also that are able to identify both problems and strategies and work on the long term. Because working at the policy level is a mid-long-term process. It's not something that bears fruits, unfortunately, on the immediacy. So that's also a problem that we might see when people mobilize a little bit in this kind of sort of ephemeral level on social media. So this is what I want to do. 4 parts, a brief literature review. A lot of it's already on the slide, so I'm going to walk you through it. Then focus on 3 features of media, alternative media, and media activism by extension that I've identified. So empowerment, emancipation, and counter-hegemony. And then I will describe what they are, and then engage in 4 main items of critique of social media. Not everything is negative, don't worry. It's just an attempt to, as I said, to connect the literature and what they said about alternative media and to see whether some of this remains in what we do today. So really, what is different is more or less what drove me from the beginning. So if we look at, well, this is more or less the body of literature that I considered, the work on alternative media by Chris Hutton, where alternative media is explicitly oppositional, but also outside the sphere of the mainstream, and is characterized by a strong oppositional counter-hegemonic character. Then you have autonomous media, which are, and I quote, the vehicle of social movements, and they encourage and help others to produce their own media products. Think, for example, about in the media. So they do not only provide channels for dissident perspectives, they also seek to establish participatory modes of communication. So it's not just about telling your story somewhere or getting your story through the media, but it's also, as this guy said, this guy actually is a Canadian guy, I think, from Simon Fraser, autonomous media perform the role of teachers by way of the good examples they provide, encouraging people to engage in media production. Then you have tactical media, which was a concept that emerged in the Netherlands in the 90s around tactical television, so interventionist media, hit and run media interventions, but they are very the same nature, short term, and that are designed to mostly disrupt the system and make people think by this disruption. Then oppositional communication practices. These are also some Canadians from Simon Fraser. The name was left out, but seeking to cultivate alternative public spheres. So there's the idea of the public that is cultivated over time, nurtured, which then is conducive to, for example, engaging in advocacy. And then my own classification, I call it emancipatory communication practices, a little lengthy and not very useful, but it was an attempt to put an emphasis on the emancipation side of the story that I'm going to describe later. One of my favorite perspectives, at least back then when I dived into this stuff in the 2000s, was the work of Clemencia Rodriguez. She is Colombian originally, based in the United States. I think now moving to Temple University for the fall. And her conceptualization of citizens' media owes much to radical democracy and feminist theories. And I very much like the emphasis on the individual and on the transforming practices, the dynamics that citizens' media have the potential to enact. So she defines citizens' media as spaces for people to enact their democratic agency. The idea is that democratic agency is not only something that you engage with when voting, for example, so once every, 4 or 5 years, but something that you can transform into a daily reality and become a citizen by doing that. I think it's important to notice that, however, Clemencia wrote in English, originally the book was written in English, her idea of citizenship is a much more inclusive notion because it comes from the Spanish version notion of ciudadanía, which doesn't necessarily refer, so it's the enactment of citizenship, is the citizenship as subjectivity, as opposed to citizenship as I hold a passport, therefore I'm a citizen of Canada. And if you're not, sorry, but you have no right. So it's a much more flexible notion and not exclusive as we would understand it in English. However, yeah, it got translated this way, stayed this way. So the notion of citizens' media implies, and I quote, that a collectivity is enacting its citizenship by actively intervening and transforming the established mediascape. Secondly, that these media are contested social codes, legitimize identities, and institutionalize social relations. And thirdly, that these communication practices are empowering the community involved to the point where this transformation and changes are possible. So it's the power of imagining a different reality, voicing it, and enacting it through media production that then makes you an active citizen. Clemencia did extensive work on violence-prone communities in Colombia, so in the drug trafficking areas. So this is what informs our finding. Then there's radical media. John Dioning, 2001, a book that I still take as the Bible. It defines radical media as media generally more scale and in many different forms that express an alternative vision to hegemonic politics, priorities, and perspectives. So he comes to this definition through the lens of Gramsci's analysis of culture and power and his notion of counter-hegemony. And I like what he says, that these media break somebody's rules, although rarely all of them in every aspect. So they are deliberately disruptive. So what are the main features if we look at this literature review? Well, I think there are three: empowerment, emancipation, and counter-hegemony. Empowerment as creation of subjectivity and agency, at both at the individual and the collective level. Emancipation as autonomy, that also derives from the anarchist ideas. And then counter-hegemony, which comes from Gramsci, as an ethical statement. So it's also where do you position yourself vis-a-vis society. So it's something that has the power to spill beyond media and media practice to permeate a definition and your engagement with society in general. So empowerment is the process through which individuals and groups take control over their media technologies and messages by participating in the actions that reshape their communicative processes. So it can be seen as freedom for communicating your own terms, so freedom for creating your own media and all of that. So the media production in particular, then become agents of subjectivity and agency. So they contribute to create subjectivity and agency. So you become a political subject precisely because you have this power that I mentioned earlier of imagining and translating this imagination into action. So it's really the exercise of active control over technology that empowers people, including non-experts. And here I'd like to quote Gretchen's workshop yesterday on demystifying technology by engaging in creating technologies from scratch. So this is exactly what I mean by empowerment. It's a perfect example. Then emancipation is, on the contrary, freedom from something else. So from commercial media logic, capitalist media, and its constraints at the level of infrastructure, skills. So what you have is teaching and demystifying as a way of freeing yourself from these dynamics. So emancipation can be seen as the efforts of these empowered groups and individuals to obtain equality and or freedom in the communication and media sphere, both for themselves and for the other social groups and individuals. The idea of autonomy, speaks to self-organization and freedom from political control. So very strictly connected to the notion of emancipation is the notion, of course, of self-determination as the free choice of individual and groups with regards to their culture and communicative future. And the third comes from Gramsci, counter-hegemony. JD stands for John Downing, the author of this book, Radical Media. Not only are radical media, and I quote, attempts to challenge dominant ideological frameworks and supplant them with a radical alternative vision, they are also conveyors of social change. And there are two aspects in particular that speaks to the counter-hegemonic level. So people engage as a collective project. Rarely you produce media by yourself, at least if you think about the media that informed my thinking here. So I was doing community radio, which is something that usually you do as a group. But also if you think about indie media, I mean, they all had an idea of a collective project at the bottom. And then the second element, the organization forms is functional to the promotion of prefigurative politics. So trying to create here and now the world that we would like to see. So creating the internet we would like to see, the mediascape we would like to see. This is very counter-hegemonic. And I think it's important to look at the work of Tim Jordan, who actually works on hackers, but who said that, but I think this applies also to media activism, not necessarily the computational part of it. The organizational forms of this movement of this media, is often an ethical statement in itself. It's something I'd like to repeat. It comes from one of my interviewees. The way is the goal. So it's not just the media production that is important, but also how do we get to media production? How do we get to the end result? That is important. So if you are participatory by default, then we should also seek participatory ways of media production. Not just, let's say, a broadcast that has different voices, but is produced autonomously by someone. So, going quickly towards the end, I have no clue of the time, but I'm also perfect. An Italian, so I can speak forever, if you don't keep me in check. So, 4 aspects of, let's say, critique of social media that I see emerging looking at this literature. So really what I try to do here is to apply these concepts that emerged from the work of, for me, these very important scholars. That was a work that, these were writings that emerged about 15 years ago by now, and see what of that can be used to understand social media. Now, I have to say that a lot of this is already in writing, but in different, in a few different articles that were published recently that take different perspectives, like the sociological identity perspective and the social, science and technology studies perspective, or the surveillance studies perspective. So 4 aspects that are, speaks to what is good and what is bad of social media in light of the above. Politics of the quotidian, politics of visibility, self-empowerment versus collective empowerment, and the creation, unfortunately, of subaltern subjectivities. So what do I mean by politics of the quotidian? Well, Rodriguez said, and she was really referring here mostly to community radio, these practices and strategies of resistance constitute the politics of the quotidian. So it's not just a media that you engage remotely because it's a television that you watch every now and then, but she was referring to the fact that media production enters in the life of these people and transforms their way of relating to their neighbors, for example. She was referring to a situation in which entire villages were taken hostage so there was a strike being declared, and nothing to do with the strike as we understand it. It was just the narcos taking over a village, kidnapping a village, let's say, as a sort of bargaining means with the authorities to get some release of political prisoners, something like that. And then these people would end up being completely scared, not trust each other, because you never know where the next danger comes from. There will be a curfew, so they also don't interact on a daily basis and stuff like that. So she said through media production, we managed to break these dynamics of mistrust and fear. And we do it on the regular basis, on the quotidian. I take this and I apply it to social media in two ways. So social media are very good because they expand and multiply the spaces for political action. So for example, if let's say a demonstration, let's say think about an occupied camp, you can either camp at a camp, but let's say you don't do that for various reasons. Well, you can follow what happens through various variety of platforms, to live streaming and all of that. So in a way, your enjoyment of your participation in a way or another gets expanded beyond the actual physical presence in the camp. So you can follow what happens there also remotely. So in a way, social media reverberates, so they expand the lifespan of an action, invading our intimate space as well, because it comes through a mobile usually, which is something very personal, very intimate. And at the same time, they allow for some sort of reverberation, echo effect, by which what I write now is then picked up by someone else, and then by someone else, by someone else, if I'm lucky, if I write something smart. And that creates a different type of spiral of engagement with political ideas, which is beyond, again, physical co-presence. At the same time, it's also pretty cool the fact that you need no skills whatsoever to engage in social media reporting, for example. I mean, I know it can be much more complex and much more refined, but also people who have no skills find it easy to engage. So this is, if you want, is the good aspect of social media. Then there is something a little more problematic, which is what I call the politics of visibility. The politics of visibility, I'm a sociologist, so what I look for in a movement is a collective identity. That for me is the main indication of the presence of a movement and the fact that the movement is sustained over time. Collective identity is not very easy to track down or to study, but it's very fascinating to engage in the study of it. And it can be, it contains usually cultural, ideological aspects, but also feelings, emotions, and all of that. And what seems to me is that identity now has been substituted by visibility. And I cut in this a little short. I have an entire article arguing for this. But basically what I say is that the politics of visibility has substituted the politics of group identity as a crucial component of contemporary identities. And what you have is that everyone can participate in creating the collective narrative, which is cool, of course. But then this collective narrative ends up being a sort of lower common denominator, mix and match of elements. Because if what gets picked up by, what I call cloud, whatever, by the group online, it's only what people share and not the most controversial elements. Thank you. So although this is a very theoretical argument, I drop it there like this. Trust me. It's not very scientific, this thing. But I elaborate it in something that I call cloud protesting, which is my notion of my way of making sense of protest at the time of social media. And I have, sooner or later, a book coming out on that, if I ever bother to write it. But yeah, the idea is that this politics of visibility has somehow taken the place of collective identity, and this is a problem. It's a problem also in the construction of publics for advocacy, for example, for more long-term action. Then I have two more elements. Self-empowerment. Yes, social media are great for self-empowerment. We feel pretty good when we get likes or shares and all of that. And it's very natural. It's not stupid in a way. I mean, it's how we are as human beings. We interact with other human beings. But then there is an overemphasis on individualism, which can also be, I ever understood, as personalism. So Lichterman, in 1996, a sociologist, wrote extensively on personalism, saying that actually personalism is not bad. It's that different from individualism, but it actually supports rather than sabotaging political commitment. Because it is actually a legitimate need for self-expression and self-fulfillment that goes hand in hand with the sense of dedication to particular people as a community. So personalism It's not negative because it supposes that one's own individuality has inherent value, and as such as the right to emerge. Now the problem is that yes, personalism is good, so this is the good side of the story, yet individualism is around the corner. And then I'm very much worried about the element of collective empowerment. So what I see in social media is extensive self-empowerment, which is the start of collective empowerment, but not much collective empowerment that stays over time. And again, I drop this there. 2 more slides. If we look at media and organization tool, and then counter-hegemony. So what we have with social media is a media of interaction instead of a media of collectivity. And the interactions, again, are fun, are cool. They do produce subjectivity, but not yet quite the subjectivity that sociologists consider the basis of social movement. So it's a media to network as opposed to media as a means to transform or reform media or change society and building counter-hegemony. So social media, for me, they score very high, of course, when it comes to organizing an action, a little bit less when it comes to organizing over time and for something which is beyond the immediacy of the next month. And then, well, the issue of counter-hegemony. How can we understand counter-hegemony in relation to commercial social media? Well, here we have a big problem. If we look at, for example, what John Downing said, but also Clemencia Rodriguez, the element of contestation and the element of prefigurative politics, well, we see that we really don't score very high there. I mean, but maybe, as Clemencia said, you know, social media might, she doesn't speak about social media, but paraphrasing, might help to contest social codes, legitimize identities, that's for sure, and institutionalize social relations. But they don't break many rules. And really they score very, very low when it comes to prefigurative politics. So they don't engage usually with criticizing the infrastructure, which is what, for example, community media has done for a very long time, and also my colleagues earlier discussing what is wrong with the infrastructure, which is the system in a way, right? I mean, I'm talking about media infrastructure as a sort of, placeholder for the system. And I guess I'll leave it at that. It was a lot of material, very theoretical, but thank you for your time.
Okay, we'll open it up for questions and or comments. And yes, please, the panelists can join us back up here. That'd be great. I actually have a question to, I guess, get the conversation going. And it's for all the panelists, really. Still trying to think through how to articulate this question, but it gets at this idea of visibility that Stefania was referencing in her talk. And I think that's one concept that stood out to me, bridging all the presentations in one way, I hope. One of my own critiques about social media, and I have been an activist for a long time, and I do use social media on a daily basis because it's very difficult not to, because it is such a commonly used platform, for better or for worse, on the left. And when it comes to this politics of visibility, I was thinking about the way in which, very often, the way in which activists engage and share articles on social media tends to mirror and reflect the hegemonic mainstream news agenda. So that whatever is the issue of the day, the most pressing, timely issue, is what activists end up amplifying through their own participation on social media, arguably to the neglect of the less sexy, less visible work of organizing that goes on often behind the scenes. And as someone who is a participant in a movement that doesn't get as much visibility, is not as sexy on the Toronto activist scene, this is something that I'm aware of and critical of. And I was wondering, in terms of Chris and Laith's presentation, if you have similar struggles around trying to make policy sexy. Is that something that you find maybe doesn't have enough support in the social media realm? If it's something that Carol maybe you thought about as well in terms of your own critiques of social media. And then I think there's also like a temporal aspect that I think, Stefania, you also briefly spoke to in terms of, again, like, you know, crises get amplified and activists jump on the bandwagon when an issue is very much in the news, again, set by the mainstream news agenda, but then things fall off the radar. And there's a lack of that longer-term protracted commitment to follow through with issues and solutions. Thoughts on that?
Policy advocacy as something sexy, or do we want people to think it's sexy? I really think it is very sexy and empowering. You know, I actually, on the one hand, I'm kind of very proud of writing all this language that we write and challenging authority in the language of authority of colonial rule in English as an immigrant with English as my second language, and appearing in front of the CRTC as somebody who's been here 21 years and finally received my immigration papers in November, okay, because of my political work. So appearing like there with all this, for me, is empowering, you know, comparing myself to all these activists that are white and born here and part of established organizations that are not doing that job. So for me, that's on one that, you know, I will give you another example that makes it sexy for me. You know, we worked on a complaint against Videotron, the biggest cable distributor in Quebec, for their misuse of the funds that are allocated for community television. And, you know, people don't know much about community television in this country, but what this means, you know, the money that is funding community television coming out of the subscribers' fees. For Montreal, for instance, that's $27 million a year. That's basically more than all the community media in the whole city, all the different media outlets on whatever format they are, combine their budgets. And the person that owns Videotron is Pierre-Carl Paladeau, was just until last week where he resigned, was the leader of the separatist Quebec Nationalist Party. So everybody hates Pierre-Carl Paladeau, all the left, all the progressives, everybody that's fighting against him in the province. And in the last 3 years, just battling for this license at the CRTC means that we've cost Pierre-Carl Paladeau millions, if not tens of millions of dollars, and now we have a class action lawsuit on behalf of the customers of Videotron to reclaim 3 years of $23 million. So we've cost Pierre-Carl Paladeau more, we've landed more punches on him than all of the left and all of the progressives in the whole province. And no matter what, we've cost him more money than all of the others that have. So that is in policy work. It's not acknowledged outside as much as I would love it to be acknowledged, all this work and people giving it the importance that it should. But this is enough for me.
I mean, what is sexy? You know, how do we do that? If Laith and I are we wearing era-appropriate attire with disheveled beards and so forth, dressing up policy? We do our best, I guess. I don't know. For me, I struggle with those questions because when I think about in the community television hearing, we were asked a question which was sort of directed at community radio and the issue of creating space for different types of programming. And one of the commissioner, actually the commissioner, Jean-Pierre Blais, I think his name is, J.P. Blais, the chairman actually, he said, well, something to the effect of, well, how do you deal with programs that just aren't going to be popular? How do you explain those? If community radio can't create those spaces for alternative programming and that kind of thing, if it has to focus on what is popular and measure those things based on popularity, then it's going to have problems from the start. So for us, I mean, what's sexy to me is communicating how policy changes things, not how it's exciting or in the moment or energizing, those other kinds of things, how it's going to appeal directly, you know, with the best hashtag or something like that, to the mass audience right away. But how can we link those kinds of solidarities through different struggles, through different sites of change, and how does policy do that? There's a hum that's telling me to stop. I don't know, but that's what I think is sexy, is advancing that change, explaining how policy does that.
I think social media definitely is the essence of social media plays into those dynamics of branding and capitalism. And we can see that in like Twitter, like you have a 150 character limit, and in Facebook, all the posts that get the most likes are ones with photos, and it's all about branding. And I think in a way it works for a very immediate situation, as Camila was saying, but for long-term relationship building, it doesn't at all, or in terms of connecting with an issue in a more deep way. So I think social media is just kind of a tactic for other forms of media, like community radio or community television, where there can be more long-term relationships established, and it can be just like an entry point in terms of knowing about those other kinds of media. So yeah, I don't actually think social media can do the long-term relationship building, because there's so much information being shared all the time.
And just to complement the excellent perspectives that we have heard so far, I think the main problem with social media is that they actually reproduce what we are used already to with mainstream media, which is an overemphasis on events as opposed to processes. But if we want movements to change the system, we need a systemic critique, and the systemic critique requires attention to the process. And how do you form the ability to think through the process? How do you actually even manage to understand the process if you just get chunks of things here and there? Well, that's for me the main challenge, which then, you know, it becomes a problem for advocacy, becomes a problem for also the systemic problems that Caroline talked about.
Questions? Comments?
Oh, go ahead. No. Who has one? I'm sorry. Go ahead.
No worries. I have a question for Stefania. How would you propose galvanizing the visibility of a protest movement into a group identity? And I'm looking at this more in terms of the trans rights discussion here in Canada. There's been a bill on the floor for 25 years. And we really struggled last year to really convert the social media attention into on-the-ground support across the country, because, of course, trans folks are incredibly diverse, but they're also very dispersed across the country in very small numbers. So it's difficult to galvanize a real movement of people. So how would you suggest that we convert the goodwill retweeting into some kind of on-the-ground actual political impact?
Well, this is a $1 million question to which I don't actually have an answer. I mean, in the sense that if that's one of my main worries, right? That we too often stop at the level of visibility and do not manage to get up to the level of the group identity, and identity that sticks, and that creates a group where you are responsible for your fellows. Right. In social media, I mean, a retweet or a like or a friendship in social media, a connection, whatever in social media, doesn't probably bring you to the streets to defend your friend if your friend has been arrested, for example. And without actually getting into that, negative, like terrible situations of someone being jailed, it is true that the group in social media is pretty much no strings attached. And I don't know exactly how it is possible to, as you said, nicely put, galvanizing visibility to transform it into something that sticks a little more. I guess, in self-empowerment, it's very important. Self-expression is very important. It's what creates a political subjectivity, but at the very individual level. Now, the fact that you like what I say galvanizes my own self-perception to the point that probably I want to reciprocate. And I mean, it might eventually transform into something bigger, but it, for me, still remains a little too volatile. And I mean, what I like, for me, the answer to your question, but I'm not sure exactly whether it works, would be then to engage in action, because action creates the group. And action usually is, can be face-to-face, I mean, in co-presence, which then manages to create stronger ties. So if you use social media to then come together, then why not? It could also become something a little more stable. But it has to be tested, I guess. I'm sure it has happened already in many other cases.
I just wanted to hear more about what Laith had to say to kind of continue on to just kind of focusing more on the process. I think you had some more to add on to what she was saying.
But I kind of, what was the last thing that you said there in the pickup one? I'm sorry, I just totally blanked out now.
Always about the moment. No, I think it's great that you hear more about that. It's just, in general.
That's what she was talking.
That's what.
Yeah. I mean, like, I'm gonna take that example of ICTV again, the independent community television project to take over the community license, television license in Montreal as an example. So $23 million is a huge sum of money. And television, I think, is the strongest medium in terms of social effect. So, you know, for me, it's more than even film or like documentaries or anything like that, or radio. So you'd expect that when you come and approach all these communities, which we did work across the whole province of Quebec, you know, worked on all the different ethnic, indigenous, social sectors, everything. We spoke to all the different levels of society that are possible, that they will all be ready to jump on this, and, you know, since the bull is down, to pull out their knives and take their chunk of meat that they're, you know, supposed to have. And it was a lot of hard work to get people to understand that there's actually a policy. What does that policy say in terms of their right as citizens or subscribers to Videotron to access to community television and the funding that comes with it, and access to produce content and volunteer and get learning skills and so on. That was a whole process that for them, you know, most of Canadians don't even recognize or understand that there is community television. So starting from the zero to try to explain to everybody, even advanced activists in every field, to try to explain to them the policy, the requirements, and the money sources, and all of these things, to get them to write a letter to submit to the CRTC is a lot of work. And it was surprising to see how much it was like pulling teeth out of people. Although the effect of it, if and when we receive the license and the funding of it, will be phenomenal. If you have an actual community television station with that huge budget that is broadcasting the positions that these communities advocate for on television, it will be just one program, let's say, that advocates for Black Lives Matter or indigenous rights and or environmental rights on a weekly basis. With that budget, will have more effect probably than all the environmentalist movement in that region. So why, how can you, so that's where you get to that situation where, okay, it is hard to convince people and to understand things that, no matter how advanced they are in knowledge, to understand something that they don't understand at all, that they haven't engaged before, a policy process and or a policy that they have never read. But the end results are worth that effort. It's definitely worth it.
I think the one thing I would, unless there's a question, I would add quickly just that policy is about, policy impacts all of us. It impacts the jobs that we're doing and the work that we're trying to engage in. And part of what makes policy distinct from other types of written rules that we're supposed to agree to or that impact us and our lives is that policy is supposed to be flexible enough to contain a discussion and to be continually revisited and changed so that it continues to reflect the needs that exist for the people that are being impacted by that. So communicating that to people and then helping them to understand the process part of it, to understand the points where they can explain what they need, explain what they want, explain what needs to be changed in the policy is part of that, I think. So, go ahead.
So something I find really interesting about all these presentations and that I'm working through on a personal level is just exploring, I guess, the boundaries of our movements and where the blind spots are that in our participation is a level of complicity, right, with the very structures of power that we're trying to unravel. So how do you address or confront these critiques on the policy side that the work is inherently complicit with and obedient to settler, colonial, imperialist sort of structures of legal power, on a social media standpoint, that your participation is contingent upon your complicity with corporate hegemony with those systems?
I would make a quick point, and I think I said this in the presentation as well, is that the way we approach advocacy is by acknowledging that there is something that needs to be changed. You know, decolonization is about acknowledging that we are in a colonized reality, and you know, the same thing with anti-oppression is about acknowledging that there is an imbalance there. So, so by taking advocacy from that approach, you're acknowledging that there is the system and that you have to identify the weak points in that system where you can start to disable it. You know, do you want the whole building to fall down? Probably not. But there are going to be parts of the building that have been created by very racist and privileged people, special rooms for only that they can access. You know, if we think of policy or society as a building, you know, privileged people have created whole floors just for themselves. And we don't want to tear the whole building down, maybe. Some of us do, maybe, but if we don't want to, you know, cause mass destruction in that sense, which can hurt a lot of other people and would have to be justified on a different sense, you can start to take out those parts. You can start to focus on those parts. Say these special floors for white people, or these, you know, the CRTC with its 98.1% only white only history. These special areas are no longer justified. They are no longer fitting with the needs and wants of society. You know, they existed, or they were created, or that habit or routine was created from a time and place where white men thought they were the only people who knew how to run things. And so that's what we see. Those are the parts we need to attack and take out.
I guess maybe adding on to that, there's the option of tearing it down, which I don't know if that's possible with social media. Everyone uses it, and it's just a platform that is accessible to everyone currently, and there's no really alternative to that. But I think yeah, I'm a strong proponent of autonomous organizing and creating the alternatives to the mainstream structures. So yeah, just like looking towards other forms of media that are alternative to social media, but within the confines of still using social media because it's the only option. I think there are little nooks that you can still take in terms of challenging it. So, I mean, just the fact that each person has so many Facebook friends and from different backgrounds and different politics, and sharing on the newsfeed like disrupts the normal wall of normal posts that people get. So just like little things like that. And the fact that Twitter has taken such a political path of for social organizing is, I think, also a way that has been appropriated for organizing. So yeah, I think there are ways within the system, but also finding alternatives is also important.
Well, thanks for the question, because this is ultimately the message that I have, which is that, by using certain platforms, we are exactly, I mean, you put it very nicely, complicit with the corporate hegemony that we intend to fight. So for me, I mean, opting out is, it's my dream, but it's not possible right now for a variety of reasons, including the fact that that's where people hang out, which is the argument I always get back when I say, well, maybe we should go somewhere else. And that's true. I mean, so we should respect that. But at the same time, for me, the first step is awareness. Using something with some critical eyes, knowing that this is not perfect, knowing that we are part of it precisely by, being co-producers of knowledge and part of their certain business model that supports capitalist social media as they are. So awareness of that complicity would be the first step. So use it if that's what takes people to the street, but then also let's keep remind ourselves that it does have surveillance built in, it does have corporate exploitation built in, and there were good lessons for the past. We did not succeed to overthrow the system, but our idea of building autonomous media actually made sense. So maybe not throwing that completely out of the picture is good to remember.
Yes, I will. I just want to add one point is that with regards to opting out, if you come from a place of privilege or something like that, you should recognize that opting out can be a privilege and that there are people who can't opt out. And the people who can't opt out are usually the ones who are the most oppressed, the most marginalized. And so even if you are at a place where you could even make the choice to opt out, you are at a point where you can recognize that you have some power, and then you have a choice to decide whether or not you have an obligation to engage the system in the ways that you can to change it for those who are stuck in it, who can't change it. And so, I mean, how that applies to social media, I mean, yeah, not everybody is on social media. Not everybody uses it. Not everybody is stuck in it. It's different, but I'm drawing the analogies from social media to society generally. But I think those same principles apply.
Yeah, I mean, exactly what I was going to say carries on from there. I'm a Palestinian, half Syrian, and this is where my point of departure comes to work in media in general. I mean, I didn't get into print media, radio, and television, and now advocacy for community media just because I wanted to be on radio and or on television or print, write stuff or take some space at the CRTC. The point of departure is that I want space for my community and for my issues and for my rights on those platforms, and they are very important for achieving those rights. There is no way for my community to be given equal space in the corporate or public media venues. So, with that power, So, and if you look at what Palestinians have been doing for decades, maybe it's a little bit different than here in Canada. The indigenous population have made different choices than what the Palestinians have made as an indigenous population under colonialism in Palestine. And the choice that the Palestinians decided is that we will fight the Zionist colonial process in every venue, anywhere in the world. Okay? And that includes running, for instance, a party that represents the Palestinian people, indigenous population, in the colonial national, parliament of Israel, the Knesset. So what does that mean? The Palestinians are engaging a colonial venue, but they're engaging it in ways to disrupt it, to pervert it, to, this is it. You go, the Palestinian MKs, the members of Knesset, that are, every time they get on the stage and they shit on Israel and on apartheid and on Zionism and on Jewish supremacy and on colonialism and death and destruction and theft of land. And every day they get up there and they get heckled and screamed at and called like racist shit by the rest of the Zionist parliament of Israel. That's a choice. To make sure that your enemy, your oppressor, doesn't have even one space that they can feel comfortable in. Okay? So this is, for me, a strategy in general. It's not something that's just for Palestinians. You have to, if you want social change in whatever subject you work in, you have to engage your enemy on every battlefield possible. And therefore, we go in front of the CRTC and we say words like colonialism and apartheid and oppression of indigenous peoples and sexism and racism and homophobia and ableism and ageism. We mention those in their face, and we turn those beautiful words that they put about community, media, and access and so on, and representation and reflection of community right in their face. Like Israel talks about democracy and justice and human rights, and then you go tell them, here is what you're doing to your indigenous population, and here's colonialism, and you put it in their face. And they, on the Holocaust Memorial Day, you remind them that they are committing a genocide against the Palestinian people. Okay? That's a strategy for battle, for social change.
Can I just add, I really, really like this depiction, the engage to disrupt is certainly part of the tactic. Applying it to social media, it becomes slightly more problematic because there is a level we cannot engage with when it comes to social media, which is the algorithmic level, which is invisible, which is there. So even if we have the impression that by flooding Facebook with good content, eventually something changes or take it over, well, sorry, that's not the story. We only know partially what Facebook does with its algorithms. They are continuously changed. There have been experiments. But unfortunately, if we transpose this excellent strategy to social media, it only partially works. And I think that's important to take into account.
Stefania, I'm not a tech, but isn't there a way to disrupt algorithms from a tech perspective? Like people disrupt surveillance technology by cutting their hair and wearing makeup in a way to hide their eyebrows and whatever else Christiana was talking about. She does in her spare time. But my point is, isn't there a way to disrupt algorithmic technology?
Unfortunately, I don't think so.
Okay.
It's called hacking.
Well,
But you don't hack the platform at that level. Not that I know of.
Ghost algorithms on your own Facebook to disrupt their. I have no idea what I'm talking about.
I think it's slightly more complicated.
You know the surveillance cameras are there. You know how a camera works, right? You can disrupt that technology. These algorithms are proprietary secrets.
Yeah.
These corporations kept under, nobody has, even the people that are working
So we need a
at a
Facebook
technical
study
level,
or
like Facebook
something.
and Twitter don't understand the whole
Yeah.
process.
Yeah.
So, and on top of those algorithms, there are individuals there's a big article recently Facebook staff filtering conservative news stories out of people's feeds or whatever.
Yeah.
So there are
So there's
staff who are
disruption inside.
also engaged in a process of curation that isn't visible
think about it in terms of the plumbing of a house which is not yours, so you haven't built it. It is somewhere in the walls, so it's very difficult to disrupt it.
Yeah, beyond that.
I mean, plumbing. We all know how to. The thing about plumbing analogy, I guess, is that everybody knows how to use the toilet. It's designed so that you know where it is, and it's a very personal thing, a personal use as well. But you know how to disrupt the plumbing, even though you don't know where it's being disrupted.
Yeah,
I
so
guess. to end the analogy there, but maybe that's food for. That's a way of brainstorming around disrupting the algorithmic technology. I don't know. Is there a way of swamping the algorithm so that they have to call in the plumber?
Well, I heard some large people are willing to take on anything we throw at them. So why don't we just
There we
mandate
go.
them to take down algorithms?
Do it tomorrow.
Okay.
One thing is that Facebook deprioritizes pages that aren't paid, but I think if you make an event for that short period of time, the event is going to not deprioritize or something like that. I just don't know about the tactic that folks use.
Bring it back to Palestine a little bit. Facebook was very important, let's say, or in the beginning, before all these clear monetizations and controls on the feeds and algorithms that are controlling what you're seeing and were put in. But at the same time, I want to say that I don't think you can have a revolution from Facebook or Twitter. It is a lie and a purposeful exaggeration that was put forward in terms of the Arab Spring stuff. Like 90% of people there don't have access to the internet. You can't tell me that what made the revolution, the upheaval that is right now there is a echo chamber of a television live feed from the street called Al Jazeera at the time in Arabic. Okay? Just an echo chamber of 24 hours of broadcasting of an image of confrontation between the street, demonstrators and the police, and we saw that in CUTV in Quebec. That was, the reason we did the CUTV. Anyways, I'm kind of diverting away, but it was to say, we saw what Al Jazeera did. We're going to do it even better. Okay, and that's what we did. We took down the government of Quebec through. Not, just CUTV, the movement, but CUTV gave the longevity and the echo chamber and the kept the morale up because it was giving a good image, self-reflection for the movement. Okay, although because of television is part of psychological warfare in situations like this, when the media constantly shits on a movement, the movement is gonna hate itself. But giving those contexts, I don't think. Facebook at this moment is its ability to even do the things that it was doing when it started, before all these manipulative algorithms were done, even of informing people of events, is now much less. I know that we used to put up an event for Palestine on any campus in Canada, and there will be thousands of people liking and sharing and so on. Now that's all gone. Maybe politics changed. Maybe there's too many Arabs dying other than Palestinians, and now every Arab is thinking about their own death and their families. But that doesn't justify this total change in traffic to these. And now Twitter, by the way, is owned. The biggest got bought. The biggest financer is Prince Walid bin Talal, Saudi Arabia, Wahhabi. Billionaire who's the biggest shareholder with what's his name from Fox, Murdoch owns 49% of his Walid bin Talal's empire, runs 90% of all Arab televisions, filth and shit that is being aired and racist and whatever, and then he owns Murdoch's 49%, and then now Twitter. So how do you expect Twitter and Facebook being owned by a Zionist to give you revolution?
It's kind of a bit of a comment and an analogy, and there might be a question in there at some point. I've heard, it's interesting the analogy of the echo chamber. I've heard solidarity through social media described as frothy, like the head of a cappuccino. It looks good, it tastes great, but it's insubstantial and it's gone really quickly. I think that the things that we've been talking about is like particularly, and it's interesting to hear you talking about strategy, which is a really important part of social movements and often gets forgotten, and you talking about tactics as well. I wanted to introduce another element to that, which is logistics, right? Because I think tactics and strategy in and of themselves is a false binary. I think the two overlap quite a lot, and we need to reconsider the way that we deal with these two categories. And then the third category, which is logistics, which is the fact that, yeah, we can mobilize lots of people with the kind of, with social media, with Facebook, with Twitter, with YouTube. We can expose things, we can gain publicity. But if we don't reconsider that in a framework whereby we're using the media in the correct way, and then we have an overarching strategy to try and defeat our enemies, then I think our use, if any, of social media is going to be one of exploitation, recuperation. And I think this is something that happened with the alternative media movement, and particularly tactical media. They were exceptionally good at taking the resources that they were given by different institutions and mobilizing them for social change. I think also in certain respects they were recuperated as well, but I think a lot of the work that they did, and it was very prefigurative in a way, the fact that like campaigns like No One Is Illegal was established at Documenta, an art exhibition, and it's been like globally successful now. And so I think we need to think and rethink how and why our politics are kind of mediated by the social media platforms that we use. Sorry, that's not really a question, but never mind.
So Carolyn and Stefania in particular talked about the most common and the sort of the dominant ways in which social media and movements or efforts to create social change kind of interact and relate to each other. You know, the dispersed personal empowerment, which is very important but has limits, or ephemeral, intense mobilizations that disperse quickly, which also is important but has limits. In doing the sort of your experiences and your research, are there examples that you've found of relationships between, you know, a particular struggle, particular movement, and social media that aren't necessarily sort of perfect or better, but are somehow different than these dominant sort of ways that it usually happens, that are kind of might give you some hope that there are seeds of different ways of relating social media and how movements work?
Well, I'm going to use not my research, but the research of one of my students who is studying Iran. And she basically claims that without many of these tools, there will be because there's no space in the polity, that without, in particular, Telegram, Facebook, and Twitter, there will be no mobilization. She, of course, acknowledges that it is a partial mobilization that includes the diaspora big time. So what you actually find on the ground there is still relatively limited, and it's not particularly visible, but it does empower people. So, for example, she has the example of women on Facebook sharing pictures, and through that finding their own subjectivity as women in a country where women are not particularly well treated, let's say. And same with Telegram for the last elections. I don't remember exactly the details, because she's working on her thesis right now. I haven't really seen the outcome yet. But she was trying to convince me that there was some seed of, if not a movement as we understand it, a sustained mobilization. Now, another element that's probably important to keep into account is that the definitions that we have in literature of what a movement is are Western. So we understand movements in light of democratic setting, where there's certain political opportunities, and the political arena might be closed or open, but still, you're not regularly jailed for raising your voice. So that's also something that needs to be taken into account. What about, for example, China and people using social media there to mobilize? It might not be exactly correspond exactly to our idea of what a movement is, but what tells us that our definition of a movement is the only possible one. So I'm not sure this answers your question really, but it makes it more complicated.
I haven't really done research, but I think just from my own personal experiences and what I've heard and stuff, I know that there are a lot of forums and Tumblrs, like use of it for queer youth, because it's such a sensitive issue in terms of if you're young and the idea of privacy and anonymity. So I think it is an important tool for queer youth to connect with each other through the internet. And I know in particular in China, there's like forums for people to connect with each other, and it reserves that anonymity and privacy and yeah.
I have a question for Chris and Laith, actually. So I think the work that CMAC is doing is incredibly important, as you've mentioned. So the question I have is, have the other national associations, such as Cactus, Acte Canada, Acte Quebec, the NCRA, abdicated that role of advocacy? Or is CMAC filling a gap that hasn't been addressed so far?
No, Gretchen. I think it's both. You see, on the one hand, organizations like, let's say, the NCRA have had a history of advocacy. Okay, the NCRA was created as a reaction by people of color and mainly Latinos and blacks and women that were organizing in the 80s. In the community radio sector, and they created a national organization to actually advocate for their positions. And now we are at the situation where the organization is 30 years away from its origin and has morphed into more of an organization that services stations that have been already established and have been populated with the dominant population. Originally the NCRA was mainly urban membership of stations that have a big population. Now it's the opposite. So it's just that, okay? So on the one hand, you have that situation. On the other, you have non-advocacy period for indigenous and or communities of color at this point. So yes, partially abdicated, partially was not happening, I would say, and therefore we're just filling a gap.
As well, but for me, I think it's not so much that the national associations aren't doing any advocacy at all, but that there's a gap in the advocacy. There are gaps in the advocacy and the organizing that's happening by their nature of being membership associations, where the representation is largely dominated by staff who are employed in stations rather than the communities on the ground. So, on the one hand, CMAC is advocating for representation by and for specific communities that are not being represented at the advocacy level by those associations. On the other hand, CMAC provides an opportunity to work on a case-by-case basis with groups of community media creators and producers who need to interact with higher levels of government, to pursue a very specific agenda or goal, whether it's, Wawate, for example, wanting license applications. And I feel like those kinds of case-by-case advocacy interactions, there isn't really another organization that provides that. The national associations are advocating on behalf of the entirety of their membership, and any case-by-case situation that arises has to be filtered through what does the rest of our membership think, or what can we do based on our position as a membership organization. As an advocacy group, simply offering our experience and knowledge and consulting services on a case-by-case basis to groups that are approaching us for that, we are able to apply different approach and tactics.
So my answer would look at the hierarchical nature of advocacy work, because it's usually a specialized skill set, legal training, legal expertise. Unfortunately, I feel that our sector has not shared that knowledge. When I say our sector, I mean the campus community radio sector in Canada. We've had a history of information sharing, but we haven't had a history of skill sharing when it comes to regulatory affairs. And I think that's a big difference in the function of CMAC. CMAC is a learning organization. We are in existence to make advocacy part of the toolkit of media activism, which is why we're here this weekend talking about CMAC and talking about how sexy advocacy work is. Because everyone should be doing this, because it's not for us that we're doing this, it's for future generations. I don't want my daughter to have to go through the shitty experiences I did in campus community radio, all right? I don't want her to have the same frickin' fights and stressed out moments that I've had for a basic thing like accessing the airwaves that we all should have access to. Right? This is a non-depletable resource. It's not going away. And these communities who are underserved by the media landscape should not go away either. And they should know that they have every right to be here. And they should have every skill available to them to access those rights. And advocacy is one of those skills. So CMAC is a learning organization for that reason.
Finally, also like that CMAC has one priority, which is the advocacy for full rights that we are envisioning of community media, and that's a difference, than let's say ARC to Canada or ARC to Quebec, who has their priority is funding and licensing for French-speaking, French ethnic stations. Literally, that's what they are. So representation for the French Canadians on airwaves through protection of these things and getting funding for them. That is a different priority that will never prioritize indigenous and or ethnic and or full access and or challenging the hegemony of francophone colonialism in Canada. Okay, so those are things that we are free of. The NCRA and or Cactus and or the ARCs will never be free of those. You have those competing interests that are in conflict with the advocacy final goals that we have. And we are free of that, and we will advocate for things that the NCRA and or Cactus or others will be sometimes against, because it's not in the interest of their financial needs and or whatever it is, and or any other thing.
Okay, so we have reached the end of our time for this panel, which I think you will agree was very interesting and most stimulating with the discussion that followed. So please join me in thanking our panelists. And it is now noon, so I would encourage you to make your way over to the cafeteria for brunch, the closing ceremony, and closing plenary. Thank you.